All right, in the bullpen today, we got Mark Meckler, President, Convention of States. He's practiced law for 2 decades, very accomplished individual. We're going to talk about the Convention of States. I actually agree with some of the methodology here, so I don't know if this will be as much of a debate as people think, but I do disagree on some of what they would like to add as amendments. Mark, welcome. How are you?
Hey, it's great to be with you. Love your story, man. Great story of redemption. So it's a real honor to be on your program.
Thank you, brother. I really appreciate you saying that. And it's an honor to have you on the show. Let's first get some background. I don't want to presume all that you know or believe about Article 5 of the Constitution, which is your convention article. But give some background to your sentiment about it and how you think it should be used in America.
Sure, Article 5 is in the Constitution. It contains the way that we can amend the Constitution. Of course, we have 27 amendments. Those have all been done by Congress proposing when 2/3 of either house proposes. Then they go out to the states for ratification by 3/4. What we're proposing is the second method, which is it's time for the states to act to rein in the federal government. That takes 2/3 of the states to request a convention. They then gather in convention when a majority of states propose amendments. Those go out to the states for ratification. So that's the general process and what we're trying to accomplish.
So let me make sure my numbers are right. It's, I think, 34 states to call the convention. It takes 38 states to ratify any amendments that oppose and add that to the actual US Constitution, right?
That's perfect.
Okay, I actually like the idea. Now, we've never used it, that's the problem. And so this is a very new concept. Let me tell you why I like the idea. I don't like all ideas, but I like the fact there is a methodology because of the gridlock that is in Washington. Now, that doesn't mean I like some of the things that you may want to propose on it. But before we get into the disagreement, let's talk about the agreement. Why do you think this has never been used, even though it is a directive article in the US Constitution? And when I say never been used, I'm not talking about everyday folks. I'm talking about people who are governors, people who are head of legislative bodies. They don't talk about this process in the US Constitution, even if they are proclaiming a platform antithetical to the federal government. Why is it that they don't bring this up?
Yeah, I think because it's really difficult and the founders intended for it to be really difficult. As a student of the Constitution, you know that the founders didn't want it to be easily amended. They wanted large, broad national consensus. And so to get 34 states to agree to get into convention is hard. To get 38 states to ratify anything, obviously even a higher bar. This is the highest bar in the American system of governance. So it's not easy. There've been over 400 applications for a convention. We've just never had 2/3 of the applications that match. That's required. It's a legal term called aggregation for the actual applications to match up so we can get to convention.
What's the highest number you all have been able to accomplish?
Well, the highest number in American history, as far as I'm aware, was 32. That goes back to the 1980s, and they were trying to get to a convention for just a balanced budget amendment. And then that started to get pushed back on, and they're way back now. Our organization is now at 15 states that have passed this. We have another 8 states that have passed it in one house or another, and 49 states have introduced it.
What is your aim? Is it to deconstruct the federal government, defund the federal government, or a combination of both?
It's actually neither of the above. The aim is to go back to the intent of the founders regarding our structure, which is that the Constitution contains a limited set of enumerated powers that were granted to the federal government. The rest was supposed to remain with the people and the states. And unfortunately, over the past 115 years or so, the federal government's powers have expanded dramatically. And I think this is one of the reasons for so much contention in the United States. Whether we have a Democratic administration or a Republican administration, you have half the people in the country are very frustrated. And that's because the power base was always intended to be in the states and not at the federal government.
Explain this to me. So if the aim is not, if you get to this place without deconstructing the federal government, I don't get the methodology, because if you are successful, it will create a de facto deconstruction of the federal government because they won't have the same authority or power of oversight. And it will also defund the federal government because that taxation will no longer have a federal emphasis, it will have a local state emphasis. And so you are now defunding the federal government. Am I missing something?
I think you actually are missing something. So it depends, and we need to be careful about how we define terms. When you say deconstruct the federal government as constructed is laid out in the United States Constitution. It's very clear, and the courts have expanded that definition beyond the Constitution. So what we're trying to do is go back to something closer to the original Constitution. So I'd actually call that reconstructing the federal government, not deconstructing the federal government.
Okay, and it would take money away from the federal government because you now have this, very emphasized state protocol, correct?
Well, I think it could, but it's not necessary that it does. And this is an important point to note. There are no policy prescriptions in this. In other words, what we're just talking about is where is the authority. So it's not necessary for the federal government to give up money, and there's not a necessary transfer of money to the states from the federal government under our application. It's theoretically possible, but it's not necessary under the application.
Now, this takes me to my next question, because I'm glad I'm interviewing you, because this is one thing that always stood out to me, and I'm sure you can provide some clarity to this. When we talk about Article 5, how does Article 5 stand up to the co-equal branches of power? How does that now work when you have a much more, let's say, subdued federal government? Does it change that structure on any level at all? And does it increase or enhance the powers of independent states to pass laws contrary to the executive branch?
Well, I do think it changes the balance of power. And I think what it does is ideally, it takes the balance of power back to the states where it was intended to be. The branches were never intended to be co-equal. In fact, Congress was supposed to be intended to be the most powerful branch of the federal government. The founders thought the courts would be the weakest. They've ended up being the strongest. And we now have an executive, which Congress largely lets go unchecked. But in regard to the states versus the federal government, the states through Article 5 were always intended to be the final check on federal government power. Article 5, the second clause, was put in at the end of convention, September 15th, 1787. Colonel George Mason addresses the men assembled and said, "We've made a mistake. We've given the power to Congress to propose amendments, but we've not given it to the people and the states." And he says, he asked this question: do we expect a federal government that becomes a tyranny to ever propose amendments to restrain its own tyranny? We know what they thought, because it was a unanimous vote without debate to give the states this ultimate power over the federal government. So that was clearly the intent of the founders.
So let me talk about the intent of the founders. I'm glad you brought that up, because I do find it interesting that on one argument, we will say that the founders were very appropriate and judicious, for lack of a better term, about how the structure of government should work. But they also made a bunch of mistakes. They also got some things wrong. And when we talk about the amendments that have been added to the US Constitution, well, that's just a fancy word for corrections, because we have evolved as a democratic society. We have said, we passed this, we said it was this way, but we have matured to a better understanding of it. So when you say, Mark, we want to return back to more so of an original design of the founding fathers, well, I want to remind you, brother, that wasn't a good idea for people like myself, okay? The fact that we have amendments created protections and rights for individuals like me, and then the federal government, as it relates to the opposition of states' rights, created added protection for individuals like me. So I think you get it when a person like myself would say, listen, I'm cool with the methodology being present in Article 5, but I'm also hesitant based on the history of what states have done with increased enhanced authority and power.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a reasonable sensitivity, but thank God that we do have the power to amend the Constitution, because that's where so many of these protections come from. It's important to remember the original Bill of Rights came because states threatened to hold a state-based convention, an Article 5 convention. This is the reason that we got this. And I think you are correct that we have the ability to correct course as a society through the amendment process. One of the things that we know, though, is that the bigger it gets, the less responsive the federal government is to the American people. And when you look at the polling, 72% of the American people say that the federal government is too big and does too much. Now, I think you and I might disagree on a partisan basis or on an ideological basis, which parts are too big and do too much. And I think there's room for debate there. But the vast majority of the American people say the federal government's too big and too much in our business and in our everyday lives, and that we'd rather be governed closer to home.
Well, that you bring up an interesting point, because I've also seen similar studies that will suggest that when they talk about the federal government, they mean government in general. That government in general has too much room in the everyday life of citizens in the country, not just the federal government. And those same studies will highlight that people actually agree with what the federal government has done in many instances as it relates to education, social issues, etc. So yeah, you definitely will have some negative sentiment there, but you will also have a lot of positive, right? Let me ask you this, because this is specific to what's happening now.
Sure.
Right now, you have a battle between what's happening with voting rights, record-breaking legislative session last cycle because of former President Donald Trump saying the election was stolen from him. Now, I believe that we should have uniformity in our elections. That's what I believe, and uniform protections. That's what those that fought in the 60s were actually fighting for. They wanted uniform protections. But these states, they want to enhance their power and turn down or turn away from the authority of the federal government to create this uniform policy. So what are your thoughts about that? Do you think that the state should independently run elections and not have accountability from the federal government whatsoever?
Yeah, I mean, let's first go to the Constitution. I think the Constitution largely gives the authority to the states on how to run their elections. But I want to be really clear, and I'm afraid a lot of conservatives don't get this right. There is a clause in the Constitution and in the elections clause that really actually gives the federal government authority to essentially do what they're doing, what they've tried to do with HR 1, I think what they're doing to some extent with HR 4, that authority exists in the Constitution. So it's there, we got to deal with it. If somebody didn't like it, they would need to change it. Those are the two pieces of our election law, though, that come directly from the Constitution.
Brother, I'm so glad you said that, because that was going to be my next point. The US Constitution, Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1, it empowers both Congress and state legislatures to regulate the times, places, and manner of holding elections. And it gives deference to the powers of Congress if there's a conflict of those exacting powers. That is in Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1 of the Constitution. So I'm glad you said that, man. It shows me that you have significant intellectual integrity about what you believe. Because you're right, I have had countless Republicans, even on my show. Obviously, you've heard them pontificate on television that somehow the federal government does not have the constitutional basis in order to regulate elections. However, it is right there in the Constitution. And if you're going to be a purist in your intellectual thinking or your linear logic, you must adhere to the fact that the Constitution does, in fact, empower the US Congress to oversee and to change matters of rules as it relates to the election. You don't have to like it, but you cannot proclaim that that is unconstitutional.
I agree with you.
Yeah. What do you think would happen, man, if, let's say 34 states, they say, you know what, we're gonna hold a convention. And I'm not saying they agree. I'm saying Democrats and Republicans, brother. Let's act like we in La La Land for a minute, okay? Democrats and Republicans, they say, okay, we're gonna do the 34 thing. That's your prerequisite to have a convention. And then we'll discuss some things at the convention and see if maybe we find 38 governors or legislatures who may actually agree on a few things, right?
Correct.
What happens then, brother, to the implementation? And let me tell you why I bring this to the forefront. Because we have never done it before. And because we have never actually implemented any one of these Article 5 strategies before. If you actually get an Article 5 convention and a 38-member ratification, the federal government does not have a protocol to implement what the directive is, or at least not a known protocol that we've seen. What happens at that point?
Well, I think it would be different according to whatever specific amendments come out and get ratified. But if you look at the history, there is a protocol. Essentially, we have 27 amendments prior in American history ratified by the states and then enacted, put into the federal constitution, and the states have had to abide by those primarily through the extension of the 14th Amendment. And so we have a protocol for doing this. I want to get a little bit more specific, and maybe I can get more at what you're asking specifically, which is, for example, one of the things that's being proposed is a balanced budget amendment. And there's about an 85% approval rating for this in the American public. It goes across party lines. So we all know we got to balance our own checkbook at some point. And so what that looks like exactly, I think we can debate that. But let's say that comes out. Well, if you said balance your budget tomorrow, not only would the federal government crash and burn, but the entire world economy would crash and burn. So what I imagine is that the folks who are preparing this amendment would create a protocol whereby certain programs are grandfathered. There's a certain amount of time before it kicks in order that the federal government can adjust. And frankly, the world's economy could adjust to a balanced budget amendment.
I like the idea, brother, of the federal government having significant power over some of the state governments that would be adversarial to me and communities that I advocate for. And until that is remedied, this conversation will always be at least somewhat problematic with me because of that connection. What are you all doing with the Convention of States, I guess, to mitigate that nuance that many people of color have in this country?
Yeah, and I think this is really important. I'm glad you asked that question, Doctor, because what we're doing is there are specific requirements around this convention of the things that can be discussed. And there are things that the American people are broadly in favor of. We poll this broadly. It's about 66% of Americans are in favor of this, roughly 75% Democrats, about 66% of independents, 75% Republicans, 66 of independents, and 52 Democrats. And really what we're talking about is term limits. Almost everybody favors those. A balanced budget amendment, almost everybody favors those. And limitations on the scope, the power, and the jurisdiction of the federal government. And so I believe that that provides the protections that you're looking for. That's my opinion on the matter. Of course, that's my opinion, to be fair.
Come on, brother. You know good and damn well if you increase some of the power in these southern states in particular, they are going to run mad with it. Come on, man. You know that.
I will disagree with you. I've been in 48 states. I don't know how much time you spent on the road, but I've been in 48 states in the last 2 years. What I love about this country when I travel is what I see, that I see the brotherhood and sisterhood of man all over this country. I'm a Christian, that I see Christians living together and working together and praying together all over this country. I'm in these legislatures. I see people of color, I see white folks, I see gay, lesbian folks in these legislatures getting along. It's difficult because it's partisan and they have their fights, but I don't agree with you. I'm not worried about the southern states, and frankly, I think the southern states are better off than the northern states. If you look at migration patterns for folks of color, they're moving from the north to the south. If it was so bad in the south, those migration patterns would not be evident. They would not be factual, and they are.
Brother, I wish I had much more time, but here's what I want to do, because I would love for you and I to debate that element of enhanced state power. Some would call it states' rights. If you want to stay away from that terminology, that's on you. I believe it is a de facto design to get you closer to states' rights. But let me ask you a question.
Well, I'm gonna jump in here. That's not true. That's not the intent. Nobody in our organization has ever said that. I've never heard anybody say that in a legislature. So I'm not gonna allow you, Doctor, to just put that on me. We've been having a really good.
No, brother, that's my opinion, brother.
Yeah, but you're putting it on me. You're saying
no. What I'm doing is putting it out there for the record. That is my opinion.
You can say that's your opinion, but you said that's the de facto plan, and that's just false.
That's what I believe. I believe that's the design.
Yeah, well, that's your belief. You actually have no factual basis for that belief. If you could present me with some facts that demonstrate that,
yeah,
I'd be happy to debate those. But you're just making that up out of thin air.
No, Mark, I could present you with some facts, brother.
Yeah.
Let's go to the state of Georgia. State of Georgia, Senate Bill 202, passed the General Assembly, passed the Senate, only had Republican support. It made it a misdemeanor offense for anyone to give food or water to somebody waiting in a line at a voting precinct. 98% of lines, those that have been actually surveyed, are in black precincts in the state of Georgia. The reason why they passed that law, which even Lindsey Graham went on Fox News and said that was a silly ass law to him. The reason why they passed that law is because there was no requirement of pre-clearance from the DOJ. Why was there no requirement for pre-clearance? Because the US Supreme Court set aside the Voting Rights Act and said this is now a legislative issue. And so the state government got an enhanced power. And what did they do with that enhanced power? They decided to make a criminal offense when there is no criminal at all. That only adversely affected 98% of precincts that were African American populated in the state of Georgia. You don't find that to be problematic, brother? That to me takes us closer to the design of what's called states' rights, where they will engage in discriminatory practices in order to meet their political agenda without accountability to any other governmental agency, because before the Supreme Court set it aside, the DOJ would have had to approve that legislation.
Yeah, and I would call that crazy over criminalization. And I would say it has nothing to do with convention of states. And you're making a straw man argument about an election law in Georgia. What you did that in response to me saying that you have no evidence that what we're doing is a de facto way to create essentially what you're saying are racist laws. That it's just not true. It's a straw man argument. It has nothing to do with what we're doing.
Mark,
you're completely off tangent. And by the way, to be fair, we have an email exchange where I told you I'm not a states' rights guy. That's not the debate that we're having today. I figured you'd try to work it in. I'm not interested in having that debate with you, doctor.
Mark, let me be very clear with you, brother. I don't give a damn that that's not what you believe. I'm telling you what I believe. Now you can disagree with me. That's an open conversation that makes it transparent. I'm telling you that if we enhance the rights of these states, the authorities of these states, I believe that they would take advantage of it and try to utilize it in a discriminatory fashion because of the historical evidence of their previous social ills. That's what I believe.
I'm very clear with what you're very clear, doctor. I understand what you believe.
Okay. All right, Mark, I do appreciate you coming on Indisputable. Thank you, brother.
Thanks for having me.